Welcome to episode 46 of the Headspace and Timing podcast, a show dedicated to changing the way that you think about veteran mental health, brought to you by the Change Your POV podcast network. Today, we're joined by veteran and clinical mental health professional Louise Sutherland-Hoyt, bringing her perspective about veteran mental health as a veteran, spouse and mother of veterans, and a mental health professional.
One of the questions that I like to ask is, you were true to the mission. You were true to that. You were loyal. You were a part of the team. Where from your family of origin did you learn that? And, generally these attributes that contribute to success in basic training, but we forget and discount them when we talk about the awful things that we experienced in our life. That we forget, where did you learn to survive? What did your parents teach you that held you together, that kept your situation from being worse?
Welcome to the Change Your POV podcast network. You're listening to Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes about veteran mental health. My name's Dwayne France, and I'm a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After I retired from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set right, however, it was just a huge useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing isn't set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support veterans, service members, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. Is One Warrior Ethos, is that a program that you've developed, or what is One Warrior Ethos?
I'm glad that you asked that question, because this, my work and focus on veteran mental wellness came from, I'm retired from the state of Nevada, and I spent my career working with mostly teenagers and younger adults in treatment of drug abuse and addiction. And when I got out, I was kind of like, what am I going to do? And I thought, I'm going to really focus on creating my own little brand. And it wasn't long after that I was listening to an NPR interview with Stephen Pressman, and he is the author of The Warrior Ethos. And this was written mainly targeting military men and women, but mostly the culture at large, and taking the archetypes of the warrior culture from Sparta and from Rome and from Greece to, and using that as an overlay as to what our culture is missing, and by not connecting with the one warrior archetype and other archetypes that have been identified by Jung and others. Where one warrior comes in is, and this resonated so well with me, is the Greek philosopher who predated Plato and Socrates, Heraclitus, had a saying, and it goes like this: of every 100 men, 10 shouldn't even be there. 80 are just moving targets. They are running around, and they, like men with their heads chopped off, they don't really know what they're doing. 9 are the fighters, for they make the battle, and they are the ones that sustain the battle and the fight. But the one The one remaining is a warrior, and he will bring the others back. Now, that hit me in a lot of different ways because, in a way, this describes the human condition. The human condition being, in times of panic and flashback, and in chaos, we are one of the 10 where we just don't even know why we're around. And usually this comes after a shock, learning of the death, a huge loss. And at other times, we are one of the 10, one of the 80, where we are just a moving target. It just feels like we're so overwhelmed that we don't know what to do. And there are times when we've pulled ourselves together and we fought the fight bravely as warriors. And there have been times when we pulled ourselves together finally and gathered everything together when we have headspace and timing all connected together and in sync, and we're operating and sort of bringing the mind and the battles that go on in the mind into unity. And usually that's a juncture that's temporary, and we know it when we see it, and we build on that. So I hope that explains that process.
It does, and it does very much, and that was amazing, and definitely, and I think we'll bring that back into. But I want to capture that piece because how you just said that, Louise, was very very clear, and as you said, very moving. I get this idea of out of every 100 of our days, 10 we shouldn't even be there, right? 10 are these just overwhelmed days that you talk about. And then, 80 of those days or 80 of those hours were the moving targets. We're just kind of, there on the battlefield. But then when we can get into, the fighters are the one that struggle, but the more of the warrior days, the more of the warrior hours where we are finely tuned, the better our life is going to be. So we want to reduce the days where we shouldn't be there, the chaotic days, and increase the warrior days.
Exactly. And emerge, with the prefrontal cortex as the one warrior that sort of rounds everybody else up in the back of the brain and the midbrain. Just come on, follow me.
No, I think that is a very, very good description. I've of course heard that before. We all, the memes or it's. Some of the other guys on the podcast might even have used it as a Motivation Monday quote, but the idea of applying that to our cognitive processes and how we can stop being cognitively one of the 10 that shouldn't be there, and we can deliberately focus and learn how to be the warrior who brings all the others back.
Right.
I think that's
and
great.
We do this through the development of tasks. And those are our treatment interventions. And as therapists, it's our job, of course, to assess which of the 100 are we sitting with at any given time in the office. And if so, what, and this could also, you could sort of parallel this with the stages of motivation. What do we need to do to move from one of the first of the 10 and into at least onto the battlefield, at least put them there in the action. Because I think that's a necessary step. When we're lost and confused, we at least need to show up. We might not know why we're there. We don't have our orders. We're clueless. We've been given equipment that we don't know how to use, but we're there. So, we need to always assess. And moving our patients, our clients, from one level to another involves client-centered tasks. And with veterans, these tasks need to be necessarily oriented to what resonates with them. And as they performed and lived as warriors, this warrior approach resonates. As a matter of fact, one thing, and then I think we can move on. I have a the Beatitudes for One Warriors, and I'll send them to you because it's a little hard to explain, but it's like states of mind that a warrior tends to, and it actually spells out the word warrior. It's an acronym as to ways to be, and to be that way. What do you have to do to be that way? So I'll send it along.
Absolutely, well and I think that, and I'll make sure that this is on the show notes, and this is going to be an amazing conversation because it just the concept of that moving from one warrior or moving from one stage to the other. There's so much. I think we can have an entire hour-long conversation around that. However, I am going to refrain myself and allow you to introduce yourself a little bit to the audience. You're listening to Headspace and Timing on the Change Your POV Podcast Network. Well, folks, you've just heard a little bit of a pre-conversation between me and today's guest, and I hope that you're excited as I am, because this is really going to be a great conversation. My guest today is Louise. She is somebody that was connected through Eddie Lazary, one of my co-hosts here on the Change Your POV Podcast Network. And Louise is many different things, and we'll talk about what some of those are. But she is a former service member. She's a veteran, and she's a clinical mental health counselor like me. So as you can tell, more and more there are those of us that exist in the community. So Louise, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you here. I was excited to learn that we knew a lot of the same people, and then during our conversation, I'm even more excited to hear where this goes. But before we get into that, I'd like to let you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and sort of your background.
All right. Well, I am Louise Sutherland-Hoyt. So you're right, I am a 5.5-year veteran of the United States Army. I enlisted in 1969 and discharged in 1974. I'm from a small town in California, Bishop, and that was a great way to get out of town and live with a safety net, being in the Army. So I was stationed at Fort Rucker, of course, in the Army Aviation School, where I taught instrument flight rules in the flight simulators. And then later, I was an air traffic control tower operator. I was stationed at Rucker, and then I was stationed in Hawaii. When I got out of the Army, I used my VA benefits and went to undergraduate school, and my intent was to be a school teacher. That did not pan out, and just life events made that kind of crazy. And I found myself just in my middle 30s in the role of single mom, and occupying different jobs just to keep my head above water and keep things going. In my middle 40s is when I decided, I need to get to grad school, and I need to fulfill this dream I have of being a therapist. And so I took all of my business suits to consignment stores and got myself student loans and enrolled in graduate school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I received my first master's degree is in a Master of Education in Addiction Studies. And I went back and got a certificate of advanced graduate studies in counseling psychology. So from there, I went to work for the state of Massachusetts, for actually an agency in Massachusetts, where I began to work with at-risk youth, actually adjudicated youth, a lot of gangbangers from South Boston, from Roxbury and Brighton area. My work history includes treating the addictions in a methadone clinic. A lot of experience there, especially with veterans who returned to Gloucester and found themselves getting involved in opioid use and becoming a part of that that horrific circus. Um, so my parents getting on the move to Nevada involved being closer to my parents who were living in Nevada. There I began to work for Division of Child and Family Services, working again with families and youth, many of whom whose parents actually were veterans and doing very poorly in the outreaches, the outback of Nevada. So I retired from that work in 2013, and my husband and I decided that we were going to move to Florida, where we could just settle in. So from here, what do I do? What does a retired woman do that has a lot of energy and doesn't want to stop? So I began to, I started a private practice, and I began to put my feelers out as to how I could get involved in veterans groups. And lo and behold, 4 years later, I am blessed to be surrounded by guys like Tony Williams and Kelly Cowell, who has My Soldier's Place. She's a Gold Star mother, and other veterans who offer services, Association of the U.S. Army, and also now as president of Florida Mental Health Counselors Association, where through our military service committee, we advocate for laws and changes that benefit veterans. And Tony Williams is really has a leg up on that. So here I am developing this One Warrior project. It's a labor of love, and using my own experience with trauma, my own experience with addiction to alcohol, and the ability to move beyond and place those behaviors in remission, and to contribute back and give back to this wonderful culture that we have that is of the military. My daughter is an 8.5-year veteran, and she, oddly enough, was at she was not involved directly in Black Sunday. She was at the first medical aid station as they were bringing casualties out. And so she still has that deeply ingrained in her mind. And I'm a mom and not her therapist.
Right.
So I walk, it's just very easy. I just don't bring it up. But it was at her gesture that got me involved in the website for Black Sunday and watching the series. It's been incredibly valuable to me.
No,
so that's my life in a nutshell.
That was and there was even, and I really appreciate even that as I was listening to you. So many parallels in my journey, but then also you being a veteran yourself, the mother of a combat veteran, the spouse of a veteran, your husband served as well,
Yes.
And so you have really sort of this wraparound thing, But even then, that was originally my intent, was to be a school teacher. I was planning on being one of those cool high school English or history professors where the kids would derail them by asking about war stories so you couldn't get homework, right? That's sort of what I envisioned my post-military career was going to be, was something in education, doing that. And I kind of stumbled into mental health counseling as well. But one thing, Louise, is it would be interesting to hear about the experiences of a female veteran in a time where even it's emerging now, but even in the late 60s and early 70s, I can't imagine that there were very many female service members.
You would be surprised, Dwayne. There are actually, if you go on Facebook, there are two websites that are specifically for the Vietnam, the early first WACs, Women's Army Corps. There are quite a few of us, and we struggled with many of the things that the women are still struggling with. And I don't know that it was to a greater degree than what men and women experience now. There was some sexual harassment. There was, I do have a history of military sexual trauma. There was harassment. There were double standards. And, I came from an upbringing where, you didn't really have to put up with that.
So it was
And
new
there,
for you.
it was
Right.
new. And, but my parents taught me that, you hold your ground, you stand your ground, and you don't take that stuff. Or, but most certainly we didn't feel like it was valuable to take it, to complain about it. We just pretty much suffered in silence. And there are a lot of women who will say that and have a lot of resentment about it today. It was a cultural thing, and apparently it still is a cultural thing that is affecting us. We have a very sexualized culture, and the chickens are coming home to roost. And Lord only knows what's going to happen. But, I have to give credit to the military because they have always taken the first steps in addressing these things. And maybe not to the effect that many men and women think it ought to be. And notice I didn't use that word should.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, we don't want to be shooting all over any situation here. But, the military has done well to take the initial steps to take care of these things. So women have much greater opportunities than we had. I was fortunate enough to get into instrument ground school and to teach that. That required some extra testing. And, well, girls don't usually do that. And, this girl's going to do it.
I was going to say times are going to change. I
This,
mean,
this girl's going to do that.
yeah, and there is a level of trailblazing. I think I just considering you as a young lady serving in the military, and then so many years later, your daughter doing the same. But there is trailblazing work that is done. And I appreciate how you said that, yes, and I served in the Army for 22 years and saw my fair share of course, sexual harassment and working through, seeing those and addressing those. I was in an occupational specialty that was gender integrated. And so I worked with females from the very beginning of my Army career and all the way through. And so it wasn't a challenge for me. I always say that the argument about women in combat ended whenever my driver in Afghanistan dismounted behind me so she would make sure I wasn't shot in the back. That's the thing for me. And so it's encouraging to hear that that as challenging as things can be, yes, the military is addressing it in many different ways, and as we often say, they're doing the best they can, and they can always do better.
Right. I concur. Even the VA, I think in its best efforts has taken strides to ensure that veterans have options and to treatments available directly through the VA, through the establishment of alternative treatments here in Florida. As a matter of fact, Representative Danny Burgess is introducing a bill that would enhance the scope of evidence-based practices available to veterans and their families. This went into the legislature last year. It died in committee, and this year we are going to be very forcible through the Military Service Committee to ensure that this gets the attention and the votes that it needs to advance. We have bills on the Senate and on the House side. So all evidence-based practices available to veterans and their families in Florida, which is awesome. Absolutely awesome if we get this going. That would include things like equine-assisted psychotherapy, which is incredibly helpful.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, I often talk about how the adjunctive therapies can support and integrate with traditional therapy, if that's what we talk about. Many, in my experience, sometimes in the community, though, some people think that's the end-all, be-all. that's the only thing I need is working with horses, or the only thing I need is the retreat into the mountains, or a time, or whatever it is, that all I need to do is swim with sharks or pet wolves, and then that's my therapy. Whereas used in conjunction with actually gaining some awareness and developing, working with a clinical mental health professional, it's not an either or, it's an and both.
Yes, it is. It's these things, it's understood, are collaborative, and it takes more than just, one agency to make a better warrior and to heal a warrior. It takes a collaboration of many hands, including the warrior.
Right, and including the veteran themselves. I mean, that's exactly it. Is the veteran has a say in this whole process too, and if they choose to I guess separate themselves or not engage in that, whether they're aware of that choice or not, that's sort of a challenge, and that's really what we're trying to do here with the blog and the podcast, is to start getting these conversations out, so that veterans can hear them. But also to help develop cultural competence in other mental health professionals. And that's the other thing that fascinated me, is you were there really as the counseling profession sort of developed into its own. You were there as PTSD was emerging, I think, as a condition, and so you've seen some evolution in our industry. When it comes to treating veterans.
Exactly. It's the amount of knowledge, research knowledge, and outcomes that we have before us are incredible, especially when it comes to our understandings of where in the brain this all takes place, and in its history, the evolution of our trauma. There is a huge connection between the effects of how intense or how severe was childhood trauma, or we call it complex trauma. The severity of childhood trauma contributes to the severity of the reactions to post-traumatic stress. And we can understand that the greater the resilience, the less at risk a soldier is likely to have to develop PTSD. The greater exposure to complex trauma, including sexual trauma, having an alcoholic or other drug addict in the house, a divorce, somebody going to prison, all of these things contribute to the way a soldier, a veteran, responds to exposure to combat trauma. What we understand even more is that it's coming out that our core beliefs, the development of our internal deepest core beliefs, and we're talking about negative core beliefs of not being good enough, not measuring up, these are developed from pre-verbal ages and are carried well into our adulthood, sometimes to good effect, and often, too often, when it comes to soldiers and veterans who had been exposed to combat trauma, these negative core beliefs and self-judgment will trigger and sustain deep feelings of guilt and shame and all of the other negative attributes that our warriors, our veterans are experiencing, and also contribute to the higher level of suicide.
Right, and I often describe that to my clients, and I've said so before here on the podcast, is, we bring in stuff from our childhood into the military. Whether we joined at 18 or 28 or whatever, we have a certain amount of stuff. That's what you're talking about, is maybe the bad things or the good things, and even the core beliefs that we bring into the military with us. And joining the military is as much a running away from. So I was 18 years old and living in my dad's basement and going to, not doing much of anything with my life. And so getting away from something, so it's as much a running away from as it is a running to. And then the experiences we have in the military can amplify that, the adverse childhood experiences and things like that. And it can amplify it and sometimes solidify it within us. And that can, without awareness on the veteran's part, that can really get in the way once the veteran service member leaves the military into their post-military life.
Exactly. When you think about, I love the way that, when you talk about attributes, what we bring, we bring from our childhood attributes as well as deficits. But when you talk about the attributes, just, when you think about the effect of basic training on a soldier, he's initiated in, the soldier is experienced to unbelievable challenges that before service he or she never imagined that they could accomplish. And can you imagine at the end of that 2 months of having undergone the kind of discipline, the kind of the new finely tuned level of endurance, the fitness of the body, the discipline of the mind. And these are values that are retained. And these, I see, are important to be certain that we plug into as we work with veterans to be able to take a look at what you've accomplished, and look at what you've achieved. You never thought you could do that. But more, if we think about a soldier's commitment to the mission and feeling guilty about it after, if he loses his battle buddy, one of the questions that I like to ask is, you were true to the mission. You were true to that. You were loyal. You were a part of the team. Where from your family of origin did you learn that? And, generally these attributes that contribute to success in basic training, but we forget and discount them when we talk about the awful things that we've experienced in our life, that we forget, where did you learn to survive? What did your parents teach you that held you together, that kept your situation from being worse?
No, I like that, and it's as much if a veteran would say, okay, well, yes, it applies to that situation, but that doesn't apply to this situation. They don't think that cognitively, consciously, but if someone were to ask that question, they said, yes, but, right? Yes, that's true. I was loyal and I was accomplishing the mission then, but now there's this situation, and we can identify to the veteran what's the difference. You can apply the same values and the same attributes to this obstacle that you did to the previous obstacle.
That's a very interesting thing, because there's that word "but," and right. I abolished that from my office. I said, we're not going to deal with buts, and so I challenged this, and to all therapists that I've got under my supervision, just say the same thing, and instead of using the word "but," switch that out to and just try that on for size and see what a difference it makes.
No,
I
absolutely agree. That is the one thing, one of the first, and when I work with veterans, I identify, and you identified the word shoulds, but I start pulling out how often they use those words should and must and but. And the way I often explain it to veterans is that the word but negates everything that came before it. So that, if my wife, who does listen to this, and I'll explain it to her later, that, yes, that's a great dress, honey, but blah, blah, blah. Any blah, blah, blah that I put after that negates the compliment that I gave before. And so just like that, veteran says, yes, that concept would have worked in that situation, but it won't work in this situation. I just negated any conversation or any thought that it would actually work at all. Whereas if I hold both of those things to be true, yes, it worked in that situation and it doesn't work in this situation. Well, maybe it's because you haven't applied it. But no, I absolutely agree. Is these common sneaky, stumbling blocks that I call them, that I use to tell the veterans. And I've even had veterans come back and said, "Oh, there I'm doing it again. I just said but, didn't I?" And it's all part of the awareness and engaging the prefrontal lobe.
Exactly. Well, it's interesting that that we're talking about certain words because, neurolinguistics plays a very important role in healing. And, we're, we, my partner Kelly and I are developing this Warriors Grieving Warriors program. And we're looking at ways to change out the language. And I indicated some of these things in our correspondence before this conversation about there are certain terms that we really need to examine and get rid of. So for instance, if I hear a soldier say, "I'm in a rut," my response is, "How do you know? How do you know you're in a rut?" "Well, I do this and this." "Maybe you need a break." "Is it a rut or is it a break?" "Well, if you took it as a break, what can you gain from this?" And our work involves recognizing you're in a break and you're stalled, and what can you do with that? There's always work in everything. One of the things that really sticks in my craw is a culture's expectation of grief and how to grieve and the time constraints and the behavior constraints. And one of the things that really gives me heartburn, Dwayne, is how on the one hand we tell our grieving warriors, our Gold Star families, you have to grieve as yourself as an individual. But here's the 5 steps that if you follow these, what they say, and on a certain schedule, and I know I'm being really black and white here, that you will get back to normal. And that leaves me with just a little heartburn in my gut, and I actually cringe when I say that. We want to grieve and our losses, not only through death, but losses of other things in our life as ourselves. And it's hard to do that when we place expectations, cultural and personal expectations, on our soldiers and our veterans.
No, I absolutely agree. I think that what we call things is very important. The way we use words or the way that we describe things is very important. And you used a word earlier, and I think as we were talking, maybe before we started, we were talking about wellness. And this is a conversation that, of course, I have very often is what do we call veteran mental health? Is it veteran mental health? If we call it something else, would it be more palatable to veterans? Would we call it, veteran mental wellness? So what are your thoughts on that? I have my own thoughts, of course, and I'll bring those out a little bit later. But what do you think about the term veteran mental health?
Mental. It's the word mental that is ingrained and steeped into the deepest middle part of our brain. And when we think mental, we automatically go right to crazy. And what could there be a worse label that we put on ourselves and think you're crazy? Though I do in a laughing way. And just the word mental itself is roadblock to treatment. I'm not mental. I don't, there's nothing wrong with my mental faculties. I think I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm totally fine. I kind of like, things are beginning to evolve. We see a lot out there about behavioral health. And the first time I heard that was about 10 years ago. And I thought, this kind of resonates with me because we have an opportunity with either behavioral health or some other term that is more realistic and less inclined to be sawed off from the body and the soul, that we can somehow bridge that gap between embracing mental or all wellness and stigma. Those are my thoughts. Mental health sticks in my craw just a little bit.
Well, and I agree. I guess I prefer to meet the hill head on. And the idea of behavioral health and emerging into behavioral health being different. I'm here at Fort Carson, and we have 5 military installations within our geographic boundaries here in Colorado Springs. Behavioral health has taken on the same connotation as mental health now, especially in the active duty. That whether it's, and I've taken to say you could call it, shoestring window washing. If it means me going to talk to somebody about my emotions, I'm not going to do it. And so for me, it's almost like a rose by any other name is still a rose. Whether we call it mental wellness, whether we call it behavioral wellness, or for me, it seems to be there's an underlying hesitation or underlying almost, a block within, again, not just veterans, but in general, to going to see a mental health professional. And I think that our profession, from my standpoint, not being in the industry is experienced as you are, that we don't do a very good. We need better PR, I guess. We don't do a very good job at describing how absolutely wonderful our services can be. Do you agree?
I do. I call my practice Warrior Wellness, and I just put my licensing initials on my business card, and they can figure that out if they want to. And I actually have begun to use the word coaching. I'm a certified life coach, and people tend to be a little more receptive of that, of being coached through some difficult times, especially teenagers. But as with you, we're between identities, I guess, as to how we can remove whatever it is that's assigned to that word, those words, mental health, because they're interfering, they're getting in the way. I don't have an answer. Right. I wish I did.
And I think we would both be billionaires if we did, but it's that idea of therapy, right? And I've written about it before and talked about it before of a veteran can kick down doors in Iraq and Afghanistan with no fear, no hesitation, or not as much, but yet you can't drag them kicking and screaming into the therapist's office or the counseling office. But there's just this idea of therapy still has the Freudian, guy on the couch talking about your mother. That and it may just be that we're. I don't know how to change that. Although that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to. That's what trying to make veteran mental health as common as talking about the weather. Changing the way that we think about veteran mental health. And I guess, and I agree, it's not the best word, but it's the word that we have. We don't call cancer not cancer. We call it cancer. And then we address it for what it is, and we address the underlying. I think it's, and I agree with you, it is a challenge, and I am also at a loss with how we approach it.
Well, somebody will come up with something. Meanwhile, our task is to continue to reach out, be present, and stay up to date with the overwhelmingly rapid pace of research and knowledge that we have out there about treating trauma, and how, you know, as we read from Bessel van der Kolk, the body keeps the score, involving the body and getting to allowing our veterans, our soldiers, our warriors to connect with the body, with their own bodies, because, you know, they've all been, you know, if they've been deployed and in combat, their bodies have responded to the discipline that they've learned in the military. And the body continues to respond because it retains every memory of every adverse combat experience. And so we really must embrace ways that we can engage veterans in connecting their bodies with their souls and with their minds. And when I say soul, you know, your heart, you know, where we experience our trauma is in our core, and that's right below the sternum, right where our diaphragm is. You know, when we are re-traumatized, that's where we feel it. If not there, then in our heart or somewhere in our throat. But it's that midline. So incorporating the body, mind, science, and of course reaching the soul and allowing our veterans to be individuals and to be themselves in terms of, yes, I have this trauma and it's not going to go away, and I learn to live with it. And we can, our job is to provide the skills necessary to help our veterans learn to, you know, you had an article on the blog that I responded to about ACT, acceptance commitment therapy. You know, once we get in the boat with it, then it rows a lot better. So it's a very exciting time to be not only a therapist, but and also a recipient of therapy, and one who can engage.
And I that's another really great point, that it is a dual relationship. It always has been, of course, but the veteran comes in, and it requires the clinician, the therapist, to accept the veteran as they are, or the client, of course. But I've heard these. We've all heard them. Of course, if we work with veterans, they come in, and I think even on one of the Black Sunday episodes, you know, one of the other veterans that he'd interviewed said that he went to the Department of Veterans Affairs and was talking to a therapist, and the therapist says, "Well, yes, you're broken, but I can fix you." And then the veteran was like, number one, F you. Number two, I'm not broken. Number three, you're not going to be the guy to fix me. And there was this resistance. And so in our profession, there's, you know, people like, I've heard clinicians say, "Oh, I love a wounded dog or a broken winged bird," and "Oh, I want to heal you. I want to help you." And a veteran doesn't want to hear that.
No, no, they you know, just cut to the chase. And you're exactly right. And you know, if we could end on a note that's important, is that, you know, you're at Fort Carson. I don't know if you work for the VA. The VA is very resistant to making licensed mental health counselors and MFTs available to work with veterans, especially those grandfathering those of us that don't have what's called a K-CREP education. And they're very resistant to that, and there doesn't seem to be any opportunity for grandfathering. And they're missing out on a whole lot of veterans, such as yourself and myself, that have some seasoning, that have experience and time and savvy under our belt, that the younger, still learning therapists have yet to acquire. So it's unfortunate. You know, But on the other hand, the VA has also made community programs available, other alternative sources of care. So that's our reality, and that's what we live with.
It is. I do not work for the VA very deliberately and consciously, and I tell my colleagues at the VA this. I find it much better to work with the VA than for the VA. Tony and I have definitely had that conversation multiple times,
Right.
and we have seen some inroads, as you said, with KCREP accredited LPCs at the VA, especially here in our local CBOC. But yes, they are anybody who discounts LPCs or LMHCs or how it is, and LMFTs is reducing by full 2/3 the number of very skilled professionals that can
Exactly.
support veterans. And even as you were talking about legislation at the national level, I'm in legislation and advocacy at the state level here in Colorado too. No, this has been great, Louise. I really appreciate you taking the time today, and even just the conversation about the one warrior. Like I said, I think that we could have a whole conversation about that. I'd love to have you back on the show and talk really about that concept and specifically what you're doing with the one warrior concept.
Well, this has been an honor and a thrill. I've been looking forward to it all week, and I look forward to the end product and engaging more with your blog and having future conversations with you and Tony.
Absolutely. We don't once we find kindred spirits, we don't want to lose them very often. So for the audience, where can they find your information, maybe social media and your web address and things like that?
I am the best way to reach me is on Facebook, and I have my One Warrior Facebook page, and under the Louise Sutherland-Hoyt LMHC MAC. So I'm on Facebook.
Okay, and I'll make sure that a link to that is in the show notes,
Okay.
and that anybody who is interested can get a hold of you that way.
Okay.
Thank you again, Louise.
Well, thank you very much.
You're listening to Headspace and Timing on the Change Your POV podcast network. And there was a lot of great stuff in that conversation. It was great for me as a mental health professional to see where we've come in the industry and the focus that we've been having on veteran mental health. I recommend that you go back and listen to the beginning part of our conversation where Louise was talking about the idea of one warrior ethos. The idea of any one time that we can be sort of frazzled on the battlefield, but we have the ability to become the one who is the warrior. And it was definitely a different way of looking at that quote that we've always heard. Really, in the wide-ranging conversation that we had, there was a whole bunch of different stuff talking about legislative advocacy for veteran mental health. We're at the point where there's a lot of legislation. A lot of people are putting things out both at the state level and the federal level, thinking they know what veterans need. And veterans like Louise, who have seen, sort of the progression over how things have gone, and then veterans like me and maybe some of the current era veterans who really want to make a difference in their communities can really take action, can really get involved, either at the local level with local community ordinances and municipal ordinances. At your state level is huge. If you aren't familiar with working your state capital, that's where a lot of the state laws are happening, and you can really make a pretty big difference if you get involved at the state level. And then even at the federal level, we're at a point where many people want to help take care of veterans, and veteran mental health is becoming a bigger and bigger topic. And so figuring out how to get involved with legislative advocacy is going to be pretty big. Another thing that Louise talked about was the impact of adverse childhood experiences and how that impacts our responses to trauma. This is something the mental health community has known for quite a while. There actually is something called the Adverse Child Experiences Survey, and it really does predict, later life challenges or even responses to trauma or things like that. And so you've heard it here before where we've talked about how we bring a lot of things into the military and it impacts how we see the world. And understanding that and being aware of how our adverse child experiences can really impact how we respond to and even overcome some of the difficulties. And then there at the end we were talking about the importance of the words that we use. This is something that you've heard me talk about often. Is should it be mental health? Should it be mental wellness? Should it be anything else that you call it? A lot of people are shying away from the idea of, mental health means I'm crazy. And I think Louise did a really good job at kind of breaking that down. And so it's really a good chance to kind of consider, what do we call it? Love to hear what you think. Reach out to me on social media or respond in the comments in the show notes, and let's have a conversation about what we should not just change the words, but change the meaning behind the words, change the way that we think about it. Since we've talked, Louise has put together a retreat for June of 2018, something that she had mentioned in our conversation about a warrior's grief. She's been kind of putting this together, working on it over the last 3 or 4 months, and her retreat called A Warrior's Grief, Tending Our Wounded Soul, is going to be looking at things beyond just PTSD and TBI. If you're interested in checking that out, I recommend that you go to projectnewhopema.org and keep an eye out for the retreat whenever it goes online and it's offered. Thanks again for taking the time to listen to the show. Now that you're here, make sure to stick around by subscribing to your podcast player of choice. You can find the show notes for this episode and all of the episodes by going to veteranmentalhealth.com or changeyourpov.com. Sign up for updates on either or both so you don't miss another episode. While you're at it, check out the other great shows on the Change Your POV podcast network. Changing Hearts and Mind with my buddy Special Forces Weapons Sergeant Jeff Adamek, the show about outdoor adventures that us veterans love so much, Neophyte in the Woods with Andrew McDowell, and of course our flagship show hosted by Eddie Lazary and Bennett Tanton. If you're looking for the total package for all the information that you need to live the life you want after you leave the military, you found it. I want to thank Doc Todd for his permission to use this track Not Alone from his amazing album Combat Medicine. Doc Todd is somebody who's trying to bring veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you can get his album by going to www.therealdoctodd.com. Check it out, because remember, veterans, you're not alone. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created enemies. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision LASIX, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing.
Stand up.
How this life so demanding. So much pain, I need plenty. I heard each time my way, but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. Yeah. You're not alone.
Oh yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, pick myself back up again.
Yeah, just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone, man. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Yeah, pick up the phone, I'm right here. And I love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sea. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain, stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.